Thanks for joining us again for this second lecture in our series with Eric Gertner. My name is Gail Kurtzman, and on behalf of Beth-Sikha Synagogue and the Adult Education Committee, I would like to thank you once again for joining us. Just a reminder that this program is being recorded, so if you don't want to be on camera, please turn off your video. And as usual, if you have questions or comments, please direct them in the chat to the group or privately to me, and we will aim to answer them at the end of the program. Eric has kindly shared with us again a list of sources, and I'll be emailing you that document after the program. So today's lecture will be a continuation of the Nuremberg trials, and Eric will focus this week on the doctors and judges trial. So now I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thank you, Gail. I learned early this morning that a friend of mine, a 50-year-plus friend of mine, passed away early this morning. His name is Morris Druck. He was a physician, a cardiologist, and he had been ill for some time. So I just wanted to dedicate this lecture to Maurice, who is a very good and longtime friend. So today, as Gail said, I'm going to focus on the doctor's trial, which was the second of the Nuremberg trials, and the judge's trial, which was the third. They were basically completed even before the 1950s. Each one took about somewhere between 6 to 9 months to complete. But before I do that, I just wanted to finish off some of the points that I wanted to address last week and ran out of time. So the important thing to recognize, as I mentioned last week, is that the first trial, the International Military Tribunal proceedings, introduced a number of innovations in legal proceedings. I talked last week about simultaneous translations. One of the other things that the trial is famous for was the fact that they used extensively documentary evidence, which in and of itself is not novel, even at that time, but they introduced a lot of photographs and films in particular, which was in fact novel at the time. And there was a very big point made during the course of the trial by the chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, that these accused in that trial would be convicted from the documents produced, created, and films produced and created by the Nazi regime itself. So they didn't really need that many witnesses to testify because, as is often the case, the evidence against them came out of their own files. And as we know from the Nazi regime, they were meticulous in creating documents, whether they would be inculpatory or not. Many of the documents that they produced are now housed in Bad Arolsen in Germany, and there's about 16 miles of shelves of documents. And somebody I met last year via Zoom is producing a book of photographs of Bad Arolsen. He was one of the first people, and perhaps the first photographer, who was allowed to go into the facility to take photographs of the facility. And about that time, you might recall that 60 Minutes ran a program on Bad Arolsen just after it was open, where one of the documents that was pulled out for them was the famous Schindler's List. So as I said, a lot of the documents that were used to convict the Nazis in this first trial came out of their own files and their own archives. And of course, the Allies, once they started entering into the camps, General Eisenhower advised the military folks that they needed to film what they found, because as he so wisely predicted, someday in the future, people will deny that this happened. And so I want it all filmed and documented so that people can't deny that it happened, because we will have the evidence. So that's another important development that occurred at the trial. The trial, as you can imagine, was heavily attended by journalists. There were some 80 American journalists. There was one main British journalist working for the BBC, or the Times, I can't remember. His name was Cooper, and he produced one of the first books, if not the first book, about the International Military Tribunal proceedings. His book came out in 1947, which is about a year after that trial was completed. But the trial was covered by journalists from the United States, from the Soviet Union, from France, from England, and many other countries. As you can imagine, it attracted some of the most famous journalists of the time. So among the people who reported on the trial were Walter Cronkite, Douglas Edwards, who also at some point worked for CBS News, Howard K. Smith, who worked for ABC. In Canada, Matthew Halton, who was a well-recognized, well-known CBC journalist, produced evidence reports from the trial for CBC. There was also, and I'm going to come back, there was also one very important German journalist who reported on the trial, and I'll come to that, as I said, in a minute. But there were also other famous writers and journalists who reported on the trial who are not the usual male cadre of journalists at the time. So we have reports produced by Rebecca West, who was not only a journalist, but an author of a number of books. Martha Gellhorn, who was a famous war correspondent during the Second World War, and is also well known for her relationship with Ernest Hemingway. Erika Mann, who was a daughter of Thomas Mann, the famous German author, and others. The individual who reported, the German individual, was a fellow by the name of Ernst Michel. He was actually a German Jew, and he was hired by a German press agency to report on the trial, which he did. And he reported under his own bylaw, and his bylaw was basically Ernst Michel and his Auschwitz number. And so at some point during the course of his issuing reports on the trial, he was asked to come to see Hermann Goering, who is obviously one of the accused, who wanted to meet this Auschwitz survivor who is now reporting on the trial for this German news agency, Dana. And when he walked into his cell, Goering stuck out his hand to shake his hand, and Michel looked at him, turned around, and left his cell without ever shaking his hand. Michel was an interesting man. He eventually goes and moves to the United States, and he was very instrumental in creating the Museum of Tolerance, which is at the southern end of Manhattan and is a famous Holocaust museum as well. So that's the end of the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal proceeding. So let me now turn to the two trials that Gail mentioned and I mentioned, which is the doctor's trial and the judge's trial. And these trials are the second and third chronologically of the 13 trials that took place in Nuremberg at the end of the war. These two trials I've chosen to talk about as opposed to the others, 10 that I could talk about, because of the nature of the defendants in each of these cases. The defendants obviously in the doctor's trial were either doctors or nurses. I think they were all doctors, in fact. And at the judge's trial, there was a selection of both judges and ministerial officials from Justice Department in Germany, as well as individuals who acted as prosecutors in the special courts that were created under the Nazi regime. And I think these two trials were chosen as the second and third trials after the IMT trial because of the defendants. Obviously, doctors and lawyers are some of the most respected members of societies generally. So I think it was important to ensure that people understood the role that doctors and lawyers or judges played in their participation in the Nazi regime. I think it was also important for the public to understand how these two groups of professionals had perverted what their professions were all about. The doctors perverted the practice of medicine who were on trial, and the lawyers in the Ministry of Justice and the judges and the prosecutors had clearly perverted justice as it's generally understood. So obviously one of the things that had to happen for purposes of the doctor's trial and the judge's trial was to gather evidence. And as of even last night, I was doing research to see who was responsible for gathering a lot of the evidence. And it turns out that there's a German Jewish psychiatrist and neurologist who plays a very important role in the gathering of evidence for the doctor's trial. His name is Leo Alexander. He was from Vienna, and he was practicing medicine in Frankfurt, Germany. When Hitler took over in 1933, he happened to be in China, did not return to his homeland, and eventually made it to the United States. And as with many of these Jewish refugees from the Hitler regime, he eventually joined the US Army, and at some point was tasked with the responsibility of gathering evidence for the doctor's trial. And he basically spent, I think he was given like something like 6 weeks to gather the evidence. And he went from one lead to the other, till he finally found the mother lode of evidence, which was in a special repository created by Himmler, where he had taken the evidence by one of the main doctors involved in these experiments, a Dr. Rascher, who, like everyone else, had spent lots of time recording what he was doing. Himmler had seized the doctor's files because he was afraid that they would fall into the hands of the Allies, which of course they did. And in fact, because he was so concerned that Rascher might be caught and tell the Allies what they wanted to know, he actually had Rascher killed. But this Dr. Leo Alexander was able to discover this archive, and the archive obviously led him to lots of information, plus also other individuals involved in these terrible medical experiments. And he's one of the main individuals in this trial who had a significant role in gathering the evidence. But as you will see in a few minutes, he also had a role to play in something called the Nuremberg Code, which was part of the judgment of the trial in this case. So the doctor's trial, like all the trials that I'm talking about, basically involved charges of crimes against humanity, crimes against peace, but the indictment in this case set out with some specificity the kinds of activities that these accused were involved with, the nature of the torture and the brutalities and the experiments that they conducted, as well as in the case of some of them, they were involved in the euthanasia program in Germany and Austria, and also the sterilization programs in those two countries in particular. So not surprisingly, the evidence in this trial turned out to be quite gruesome because they went through some of the terrible experiments that the Nazi doctors conducted. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One that Alexander spent a lot of time investigating was they would take camp prisoners and put them into freezing cold water, like 36 degrees Fahrenheit, to see how their body reacted to the cold. They would leave them in this cold water. And obviously we know that eventually you can die from hyperthermia if you are left in these cold conditions. And basically what Rascher was trying to do with these experiments was to see how long Germans who were, for example, shot down in planes could survive in the water, and what they could do to help them survive if they were actually shot down above the water and were left alive still when they came down in the water. So he conducted a number of experiments using these inmates to find out what information he could about how the body reacts to this kind of extreme cold. There were other experiments where they deprived people of oxygen because that again replicated what would happen to a pilot who might have been shot down in a plane. So basically it was all for purposes of the war effort, but it was pretty gruesome, and obviously none of the individuals involved in these experiments consented to any of this. And that becomes obviously a very important point throughout the trial, and obviously extremely important when it comes to the creation of what I've already referred to as the Nuremberg Code. I want to spend a few minutes on one of the individuals involved in the trial because of the accused in this case, which I think there were 24 originally, and some eventually don't make it to the trial because they commit suicide. There's one woman whose name is Berta, just one second, Oberhauser. And she is a doctor at Ravensbrück. And she is involved with the main physician in Ravensbrück conducting experiments on some of the prisoners there, which started in 1942 and run till 1944. And the main targets, and there's a book written about this, which I'll mention in a minute, are in fact not Jewish prisoners, although there were some Jews involved, but mainly a group of Polish women prisoners who had been arrested and deported to Ravensbrück because they were acting for the Polish resistance or were spies for the Polish troops. What they did with these women is they eventually brought them into a surgical unit in Ravensbrück, and they would produce cuts in usually in their calves or in their thighs, and then would put all kinds of unusual material, like pieces of broken glass or splinters of wood, and they would sew them up and see how their body reacted. Because again, they were trying to replicate what might happen to a soldier who was injured in war and what they could do to help the soldiers survive. Some of these women actually died as a result of these experiments, but a significant group of the some 90 odd women actually did survive. And eventually after the war, they went back to Poland. Now there's been a book written about this group of women and these experiments and what happened to them after they returned to Poland. It's called The Lilac Girls, and I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in the subject. The women acquire the nickname of the Rabbits of Ravensbrück, and they're called rabbits because of the fact that the surgeries that were done on their legs resulted in them not being able to walk normally, so they had to hop. So they looked like rabbits. And obviously these women went through terrible tortures. They woke up not knowing what had happened to them. In some cases, some had a great difficulty recovering from these surgeries. And as I said, they returned to Poland after the war with these terrible wounds that they had suffered and these disabilities that they had incurred as a result of these experiments. Eventually, somebody got interested in their story. And fortunately, it was a woman by the name of Carolyn Faraday, who was an American socialite who was pretty well connected. And she eventually ended up speaking to the editor of the Saturday Evening Post to run a story about these women. And at this point in time, this is sort of in the early 50s, I mean, people were sort of tired of war stories, but their story, the story of these women, the Rabbits of Ravensbrück, attracted enormous attention. People started offering them presents, clothes, anything that they could do to make their life better. And eventually, Faraday, with the help of many others, was able to bring a number of these women to the States to have surgery to correct the injuries that they had suffered. They became celebrities in the Saturday Evening Post and a number of newspapers for months on end as they traveled across the country. And the women were distributed in a variety of different places, medical centers across the United States, some on the East Coast, Eventually, they end their journey in the United States with a visit, I believe, to Disneyland, and eventually they return to Poland, and they're much improved as a result of the American medical attention. So this is one story of the victims of these medical experiments conducted, not just in Ravensbrück and not just in Auschwitz, but virtually all of the major Nazi camps in Europe. The rabbits of Ravensbrück are also of interest because one of the individuals that Carolyn Faraday is able to convince to help is one of the Nuremberg prosecutors by the name of Benjamin Ferencz, who many of you, I'm sure, have heard of. He is now 101 years old. He did one of the trials in the Nuremberg trials called the Einsatzgruppen trial. At the age of 27 years old, he'd been a lawyer since he was 25. And he has made a life career of trying to deal with war crimes and things like genocide. And so he was asked to help obtain compensation from the German government for these women in particular. Why did Carolyn Faraday come to Ferencz? Well, Ferencz had already, in the early 50s, helped to negotiate agreement between the German government and the Israeli government to provide payments to the Israeli government to help with the resettlement of the many survivors who ended up in Israel. It was an agreement that was terribly controversial. There were protests against the agreement in Israel, and there were protests against the agreement in Germany, but it did go ahead. And Benjamin Ferencz basically started a newspaper campaign to pressure the German government to help these women. And so there would be stories planted in the papers in the United States, one every week or one every couple of days. And eventually the German government, which had been reluctant to pay compensation to these Polish women who are not Jews and were not covered by the agreements to provide compensation to the Jews, the German government basically gave up and said, okay, we've had enough bad publicity, let's make a deal. And eventually he was able to obtain compensation for these women. As I said, I think it was very important to run this trial. This trial was important for the reasons I've given before. And one of the results of this trial, in which 7 of the accused were convicted and executed within a matter of days after their conviction, 7 others received prison sentences. But as we know from many of these trials, even though the prison sentences initially were lengthy in some cases, most of them were ultimately commuted, so they only served somewhere between 5 to 10 years. So they were convicted, and they did have obviously this black mark, but there were a number also obviously who were acquitted. What comes out of this trial, which is of extreme importance, is the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code is a set of principles that were, as I said, appended to the judgment of the judges in this case, setting out the proper way and approach to research on human beings, medical research. Obviously, we know now that for the treatment of individuals, you need their consent. And obviously, you would think that was equally true, if not more so, for human beings when they were the subject matter of research. That wasn't all that clear, and exactly what the principles should be for such research was not clear. And so the judges in this case, with the help of Leo Alexander, the doctor who I mentioned earlier, and another doctor who was providing advice to the court, they came up with a set of principles which became known as the Nuremberg Code, and was the first major code to set out the approach that researchers have to take to human subjects. And obviously, one of the main features of this code was you had to get consent. The consent had to be informed. and that's now obviously a given. But a number of the other principles dealt with things like looking at the risk benefit of research. So if there was going to be some obvious benefit of the research and it outweighed the risk, then the research could proceed. Obviously, all of that would have to be outlined to the potential research subject. If during the course of the research, it became obvious that the research was harmful to the subjects, you would have to stop. Basically, this Nuremberg Code sets out all these guidelines for medical research. And while there have been many variations of this code since 1947, the basic principles of the Nuremberg Code apply in virtually certainly every Western country, I would say. They come under different names, and some people have added certain requirements or restrictions, but the Nuremberg principles, I think, are the bedrock for this kind of medical research. It obviously would have been relevant to the research that led to the creation of our now COVID-19 vaccines, whether they be the Pfizer, the Moderna, the AstraZeneca, or whatever. All of those, all of that research would have been subject to some kind of principles similar to those in the Nuremberg Code. If you looked up the code in Wikipedia, you would see a paragraph that deals with its importance. And I'm just going to read briefly from what that Wikipedia article says. It says the code has not been officially accepted as law by any nation or as official ethics guidelines by any association. In fact, the code's reference to the Hippocratic duty to individual patients and the need to provide information was not initially favored by the American Medical Association. But obviously, eventually, it was adopted. The fact that it was adopted didn't mean that it has always been followed. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of instances in which post the Nuremberg doctors trial, there were medical research was being conducted which did not comply with the Nuremberg principles, which have had, and one of them in particular has had a long-term impact on trust of the medical profession and medical science in particular. Some of you may be familiar with the Tuskegee experiments, and these were this was research done on Black Americans in Tuskegee at a medical institute in Tuskegee. The men involved in this research were men suffering from syphilis. And basically the research was following the progress of the syphilis in these men. They weren't being treated with anything. And why it's controversial is that, but by the time the end of Second World War occurs, and this experiment or research is being conducted starting at about the middle of the war and goes to about 1970, penicillin was known as an effective treatment for syphilis, but these men were not given penicillin because that would defeat the purpose of the research, which was to see how the men coped with syphilis and what the implications of syphilis for these men were. That obviously has resulted in many members of the Black community distrusting the medical profession or medical science in particular, because most of these men, obviously because they were not treated, died as a result of being subjects to this research. So that's sort of one of the legacies of this Tuskegee experiment. The other very controversial example of how the Nuremberg codes were not followed is a case that involves the CIA and Canada. Now you might wonder what the CIA and Canada have in common. Well, the CIA was conducting experiments, obviously for purposes of their own, to determine whether certain drugs, what impact the certain drugs would have for purposes of obtaining confessions or information from individuals. The program, not surprisingly, had a code name. It was called MK Ultra. The CIA decided that they needed the help of a doctor at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Donald Cameron, and he participated in the studies that the CIA wanted to carry out. You may have also heard about these experiments because one of the drugs that they used was LSD. It was one of the early experiments. One of the people that received LSD, I think in the course of one of these experiments, was Timothy Leary, the man who became one of the promoters of LSD in the hippie years of the 60s and the 70s. Obviously, many individuals involved in the study were damaged as a result of the drugs that they took. And eventually, a suit was brought by a number of them against the US government, which unfortunately went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the claimants lost by a majority of 5-4. And the basis upon which the lawsuit failed was a doctrine called the Ferries Doctrine in US law, which basically said, if there's a trial that's going to disclose military secrets, the trial can't proceed, because we obviously don't want these secrets to come out in the open. And so the case was dismissed by the court on a 5-4 split. Among the dissenters in that case, so there's an interesting split, is Justice Brennan on the liberal side and Sandra Day O'Connor on the more conservative side. Both agreed that the case should proceed regardless of the Ferries Doctrine. Brennan said as follows: the medical trials at Nuremberg in 1947 deeply impressed upon the world that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. The United States Military Tribunal established in the Nuremberg Code as a standard against which to judge German scientists who experimented with human subjects. In defiance of this principle, military intelligence officials began surreptitiously testing chemical and biological materials, including LSD. And O'Connor sort of said the same, something very similar. No judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknown human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi officials who experimented with human subjects during the Second World War, and the standards that the Nuremberg Military Tribunals developed to judge the behavior of the defendant stated that the voluntary consent of the human subjects is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is to see that the victims are compensated as best they can by the perpetrators. Interestingly, this case brought by the victims of MK Ultra is the only US case in which the Nuremberg Code has been cited. In contrast, the Nuremberg Code has been cited in a couple of at least Canadian cases. There's a case 2 years ago in a case called Barker and Barker, which again results from a series of experiments at a mental institution in Ontario, where the court found in favor of the 26 claimants, and in the course of his judgments refers to the Nuremberg Code as sort of the guiding principles for experimentation on human subjects. And there's another case from Alberta, which does something very similar. So the Nuremberg Code is probably the most important development that comes out of the doctor's trial. Obviously, it's important to convict the individuals involved in this horrific human experimentation that took place in the various concentration camps. But as a lasting benefit from those trials, clearly the Nuremberg Code is probably the most important. And the Nuremberg Code not only is obviously the guidepost for experimentation on human subjects, but obviously also results ultimately in our own doctrine of informed consent for all medical procedures. So this is one important development that comes out of that trial. Now, interestingly enough, in our present day, there are people who are referring to the Nuremberg Code. In the last few months, there have been a number of reports about anti-vaxxers citing that vaccines produced by Pfizer, Moderna, and everyone else to mandate those vaccinations is a violation of the Nuremberg Code. In fact, my sister, who is executive director of an organization, had an employee who sent her a long 7-page letter telling her why she didn't want a vaccine, even though it was being mandated. And one of the reasons she gave was it would be a violation of the Nuremberg Code. All of that, of course, is complete and utter nonsense. The Nuremberg Code does not deal with vaccines which have gone through research and government approval. These are not experimental vaccines. These are vaccines that have gone through the process of research in accordance with the Nuremberg Code principles, and they have been approved by the government. There's no experiment here. We now know for sure, with millions of people who've received these vaccines, that they were properly approved as safe and effective by the FDA in the United States and Health Canada here and the EU regulatory body that approves vaccines as well. So if you hear somebody talking about vaccines and how they violate the Nuremberg Code, you can tell them that's utter, complete nonsense. It's not a violation of the code because the vaccines do not involve research at this point. They involve the application of proven treatment for COVID-19. So that's the doctor's trial. One last point I'll make about the doctor's trial. It took the German Medical Association over 60 years after the end of the war, actually probably closer to 70 years, to apologize for the actions of medical doctors in Germany and during the Second World War. And not surprisingly, there was a similar apology for the legal profession, on behalf of the legal profession, for the actions of the lawyers involved in the prosecution of cases on behalf of the Nazi regime. So that's a good point to turn to the judge's trial. So the judge's trial, obviously, as I mentioned before, involved a number of judges and prosecutors involved in cases in Nazi Germany and in Austria, and also a number of Ministry of Justice officials who were involved in the creation of many of the discriminatory laws and the creation of these special courts that existed to try a number of different cases. And it was obviously very important that these individuals also be brought to trial, because one of the purposes of all these trials was to point out how far the German society, which is one of the most cultured in Europe at the time, if not the most cultured, had fallen from their pedestal up here to resorting to depraved actions, both by doctors and lawyers. Again, there were a number of individuals who didn't quite make it to the trial because they died during the course of the last part of the war, where they committed suicide. But there were a number of officials, 7 of whom were eventually convicted and executed, 7 others who were convicted and sentenced to terms of imprisonment. Again, the sentences were usually shortened. I'm going to refer to one particular accused in a few moments. But again, it's a very important trial because basically it's saying, look, you can have law, and obviously everything, as I've said in other courses, everything that the Nazis did was done according to law. They had suspended the Weimar Constitution. They had deprived people of their rights, but every restriction of the liberties of Jews or others was enacted by law, by an order of the German government. It was obviously not a functioning democracy at that point in time. It was a dictatorship, but they didn't avoid sort of crossing their T's and dotting their I's from the point of view of the law. But it was really a perversion of the law. It made law completely arbitrary, as you'll see in a few moments. And so it was important for the world to understand that the rule of law doesn't just mean you have rules that you can apply regardless of what they are. The rule of law requires certain conditions and protections, and they were not followed by the Nazi regime. So I want to talk about a couple of cases. One is the subject matter of a recent book, and the book is by a woman by the name of Rebecca Donner. She has written a book called All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. And it's a story about her great aunt, a woman by the name of Mildred Harnack, who was an American living in Germany, eventually married a German who got her PhD. But when Hitler came to power, she and her husband and others joined the resistance. They tried to discourage Germans from following the Nazis. They were busy handing out leaflets and doing other things. But unfortunately, eventually this group, which became known as the Red Orchestra, many of them were caught by the Gestapo. Mildred Harnack was tortured and eventually put on trial. And in the course of her trial, she was convicted of treason against the state, but not against the government. Sorry, she was the other way around. She was convicted of treason against the government, but not the state. And that was important because treason against the state was punishable by death, but treason against the government was not. And when she was tried, and basically the trial took a day, she was convicted and she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The result of the trial infuriated Hitler, and he demanded that she be tried again so that she could receive the death sentence. Now, of course, we all know once you're tried for certain actions, you can't be tried again. That's double jeopardy. But German judges and German officials followed something called the Führer's principle. And if you can guess what it is, it's basically, we will do what either we're told to do by the Führer or what we think the Führer wants. That was the legal rule in effect that a lot of these judges were applying. And so when Hitler demanded that she be tried again so that she could be given the death penalty, that's what happened. She was tried again and she was convicted and she was eventually executed. So that gives you an idea of the perversion of German justice. The other famous case is the one that's depicted in the movie Judgment at Nuremberg. Now you'll remember one part of the movie is devoted to the accusations against Bert Lancaster, who's a German judge. One of the cases he hears and decides is a case involving a German woman who lives in the same building as a Jewish man, and they are accused of having illicit sexual relations. The woman denies it on the stand. The man denies it as well. Despite all of that and the absence of any real proof of any such illicit affair, Bert Lancaster convicts the man and he is sentenced to death. And that sentence is carried out. And Bert Lancaster in the movie, understands how he's gone awry which I think is probably not true of most of the people involved in the judge's trial. But that is an example of the perversion of the German justice system at the time. The judge who tried that case, the character who Burt Lancaster portrayed, is a judge by the name of Oswald Rothsug, and he was actually one of the defendants in the judge's trial. He was in fact convicted, sentenced to a prison sentence, which of course, as with many of them, was shortened. And so he lived out his life in Germany, not in jail, but as a free individual. So we are near the end of our 50 minutes. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay.
Thank you, Eric. Oh, I'm gonna, get you back on the screen. One moment.
Okay.
I have one question while we're waiting. If anybody, again, just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put it in the chat. Who, as with the first major trial, who were the judges in these trials? Did all those countries come together again and work collaboratively?
No. The only trial with judges from the 4 major allied countries was the first trial. All of the other trials of the 13 trials were conducted by American judges, usually with American prosecutors, and they conducted, like the doctor's trial was conducted by 3 American judges from 3, I think, different state courts, and that would be the case for all of the other trials at Nuremberg. What is important for people to understand is that the number of people charged during these 13 trials is infinitesimally small of all of those involved in the criminal acts of the Nazi regime. They were obviously the major examples. So they took the industrialists, they took the Einsatzgruppen, they took the doctors, the lawyers, the chiefs of the Nazi regime. But there were, it's estimated by some that there were at least 200,000 war criminals, German war criminals. Others have said there's probably 1 million war criminals. And while there were others who were tried in other proceedings, both in Germany after these trials, in Poland, and in other European countries, it's estimated that the number of people who were ultimately tried for crimes against humanity was a tiny percentage of that number.
We have a question here.
Mm-hmm.
What was the role of the professional associations for the doctors and the lawyers? Did you hear of anyone resisting orders?
I'm sure there were some. I mean, basically, the 2 organizations, the Medical Association and the German Bar Association, were basically captives of the Nazi regime. As associations, they were basically following what the government wanted. But what's interesting is, of course, the extent to which in each of these professions, the members, the doctors on the one hand and lawyers on the other, the extent to which they actually chose to become members of the Nazi Party. You obviously didn't have to be a member of the Nazi Party, but more than 50% of the doctors in Germany joined the Nazi Party. Huge, that's a huge percentage, much higher than the general public. Insofar as the lawyers are concerned, it wasn't quite that high, but again, it was quite high. And again, much higher than the average in the general population. So they believed that there was some benefit or some protection that they would receive by becoming members of the Nazi Party, which I'm sure was in fact true for some of them. But if you look at what these doctors did in particular, you can't understand how people who are trained physicians, trained to help people, could do what so many of them did.
This is a follow-up. Thank you, Shelley, for sending this in. What is the message for professionals today then, especially you being a retired lawyer? What could have been done to resist this? It's interesting because I'm thinking of what's going on in the United States with some of the laws that are being changed.
Well, I think it's not just the law, it's the lawyers involved. I mean, Trump has lawyers. These lawyers they believe they're doing the right thing by their client. They obviously, as has been apparent in some cases, are not seen that way by judges who are considering disciplinary actions that have been brought against them. So the commentary by the judges entertaining these disciplinary proceedings, they are definitely not complimentary to these lawyers. And in many cases, the lawyers have actually not followed what they are required to do to present unsubstantiated evidence to a court. You can't just say, hey, this is what I think. They say, I have this evidence, I have this affidavit. Well, as the judge involved in one of the Giuliani disciplinary proceedings says, well, like, what did you investigate? Well, I didn't have time to investigate. This had to go before the court. Well, that's not really how it works. So there's a message there that, the fact that you've got this autocratic president doesn't mean you should be cutting corners on the law. Obviously, there's always going to be people who believe they can get ahead that way, but that's a very slippery slope for them and eventually for our whole society.
Currently, we don't have any more questions. I don't know if you wanted to give us a preview of what's going on next week.
Yeah,
because
I'm not going to do
kind
that.
of leading.
I'm not going to do that because there's one aspect of the first trial I didn't mention because I didn't think I would have enough time.
Okay.
There were a number of people advising, especially the British team in Nuremberg at the International Military Tribunal, and advisors to the American team. Insofar as the British team was concerned, one of their major advisors was a legal professor by the name of Hirsch Lauterpacht, who was then, and for many years after that, recognized as probably the foremost expert in international law. The Americans, on the other hand, they had a number of experts, including members, representatives from Jewish organizations, which you'll remember I talked about Thomas Dodd, who thought Jews should get out of the way because they were going to interfere with what was going to happen and it would be a black mark because there were too many Jews involved. Well, there were a number of Jews advising the Americans as well. So there was a fellow by the name of Jacob Robinson who represented one Jewish organization, but there was an important individual by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who was also advising Robert Jackson. The interesting thing is Lauterpacht and Lemkin both studied law at whatever name you want to use, Lviv, or Lemberg, about the same time, not exactly the same time. And ultimately, they become the subject matter of a book called East-West Street by Philip Sand, which I highly recommend that people read. Lemkin and Lauterpacht, Lemkin was promoting this idea of the charge of genocide. These people should be charged with genocide. Well, genocide didn't exist as an offense at the time, but that's what Lemkin was promoting. From an early age, he had been fascinated by the mass murder of the Armenians in 1915 by the Turks. And he basically made it his life's work to try to promote this idea that the committing genocide should be a crime against international law. And obviously that was not the case in 1945 when the International Military Tribunal was meeting. Lauterpacht was a little bit more sanguine about that. We know ultimately that Lemkin wins because in 1948, the UN adopts the Genocide Convention. In 1951, it comes into force. And Lemkin is recognized as the father of that Genocide Convention. He after Nuremberg, he went to the States and again kept promoting this idea. The saddest thing is that Lemkin dies in 1957, or at the age of 57, I can't remember, but as a young man, and he's buried in New York, and his funeral is attended by 7 people. He is the father of the Genocide Convention, which not only has obviously played a very important role in post-war society and law, but it led ultimately to the International Criminal Court, to the criminal trials involving Rwanda and Yugoslavia. This poor man who basically, this is what he wanted to do. This is what he achieved. Eventually becomes a nobody until more recently, his whole history is rediscovered and his role in promoting the Genocide Convention is now well recognized.
Wow, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Margot writes in our chat, Michael Cater at York wrote a very good history book, Doctors Under Hitler.
Yeah, there have been many books. There have been many books written about it. Another point about the doctors, again, I didn't know how much time we'd have. One of the controversies that resulted from all this medical research that the Germans was doing was, to what extent should we today rely on the results of some of that research? Because this research is obviously tainted. They had patients who did not consent, patients who were tortured, patients whose lives really didn't matter to the researchers involved. Not only that, there's a famous medical atlas. As people know, one of the great American textbooks on anatomy is Gray's Anatomy, and not the TV series. There's another one by a German called Pernkopf's Atlas. And Pernkopf's Atlas has a significant number of photographs of obviously bodies that he had examined. A number of them had been prisoners at the various camps. And so for the last, I'd say 30 or 40 years, there's been a great push against using the Pernkopf Atlas as a resource for doctors involved in surgery. But the line is not, crystal clear. So one of the things I came across is cases in which doctors have used Pernkopf Atlas with respect to particular surgeries and wondering whether it's appropriate. And there, in fact, are sort of rabbinical scholars who've looked at this issue. And not surprisingly, in most cases, they say, obviously, this is tainted. Obviously, this is bad. But if these diagrams and in some cases, this research could result in the saving of a life, while at the same time recognizing the dignity of the individuals involved in this research, or the dignity of the individuals who became the subject matters of these photographs, you can go ahead and use it. But generally, it's discouraged. So that's just another upshot of all of this German medical research during the course of the war. And we're still living with it.
We're at 2 o'clock now. Do you want to just briefly give us a preview of next week?
Yeah, so next week, I'm going to talk about Holocaust comparisons. I gave you sort of a little taste of it today when I talked about anti-vaxxers using the Nuremberg Code, but I don't have to tell you that anti-vaxxers and I would say anti-Semites around the world have sort of glommed on to this idea of mandating vaccines, mandating masks is the equivalent of what the Nazis did to the Jews in Europe. And of course, nothing could be further than the truth. Nothing could be more obscene. And so what I'm going to talk about next week is basically why people are doing this, who is doing it, and what do we do to fight it?
Great. So just a reminder, please join us next Thursday at 1 o'clock. And also I'm going to plug another event that we have tonight. Please remember to join us at 7:30 tonight. It's Beth Tikva Women in conjunction with Musica Beth Tikva. We have Reuven Grainer, who's part of our Beth Tikva band. He's giving a lecture on jazz.
Oh boy.
So, yes. So we look forward to seeing everyone again tonight. Thank you, Eric, and thanks everyone for joining us. See you next week.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.